Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the time. And uh, uh, I think, as President Reagan said famously in a debate once, here we go again. And as my friend Mr. Gosar said, this is about the fifth, sixth version of this piece of legislation. And before I make any comments on this legislation, I want to advise the chairman and the ranking member that I made a request to Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member Markey to delay this hearing until there is meaningful government-to-government consultation between the federal government and tribal nations affected by this legislation. And that's consistent with the federal agency and tribal memorandum of understanding that's in place right now. And I would, again, urge that consideration. I've also asking that we ask the State Department to verify that this particular decision on 687 does not violate any resolution that this Congress has passed with regards to sanctions, economic sanctions on Iran, or any company or entity that does business with them. It's our understanding that Rio Tinto, the parent company of subsidiary Resolution Copper, joint operates a uranium mine of all things in Namibia. And I would suggest that before you take my word for it or take the denials as truth, that a formal request from the chair and the ranking member to the State Department to validate and verify that. We've all passed resolutions, and the urgency of those resolutions has come for the protection of Israel. I would suggest that that is one. The last time we had a motion to recommit on the same subject, we split entirely along party lines. Democrats supporting the motion to recommit and every Republican opposed to it. Before we cross that bridge again, I would suggest we get information. This legislation, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, is a deception. Even today, we have no one from Rio Tinto or its subsidiary Resolution as a witness available to answer questions, questions dealing with transparency, the due diligence, and what is the return for the taxpayer. There's a tattered history to this legislation and this deal, but the fundamental and consistent reasons for opposition remain the same, pre or post NEPA. The company says we're going to obey everything, but once it is in their hands and it's privatized, the federal land, no matter what is found in NEPA, no matter what is found in environmental impact statement, there is nothing the government can do to assure compliance. So when we say we're okay with NEPA after the fact, the law is moot after the fact. Native Americans, and you're going to hear from them today. We have the chairman and the president of the Hopi and Navajo Nation, as well as the chairman of the All Indian Pueblo Council, representing 20 pueblos in New Mexico and Texas that are here, not only in support of their colleagues, San Carlos Apaches, but also in opposition to this bill. And the opposition continues the same. What's the value of the resource? 60 billion, 100 billion, what's under that land? And is the trade that we're talking about, is that a fair return for the taxpayer? I understand the value is proprietary to the company, but I think some due diligence on the part of this committee to understand value and what we're giving back to the taxpayer is an important issue. I mentioned the issue of sanctions. I think all the legitimate opposition and concerns that we have is always met with you're anti-jobs, you're anti-mining. Well, I think there's a rush for this legislation because there is an erosion of local support. There is unanimous opposition among Native Americans, not only in Arizona, but across the country. And there is a track record for Rio Tinto with regards to labor violations, environmental violations, and failure to do reclamation. So why the rush? Perhaps there's a feeling there's a much more accommodating presence at the Senate that would allow this bill to go as is. Perhaps it is that there's hemorrhaging local support in the region for the mine, and let's do it now before that support eradicates entirely. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we do our due diligence and be true stewards of our public lands and the responsibility we own. We are not Walmart greeters for Rio Tinto or its subsidiaries. We are not facilitators or brokers. This cozy deal before us today in the form of H.R. 687 is the same deal we saw before and before and before. We're doing it again, and the opposition to the points remain the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you for your testimony.
The public interest requires a complete and full informed appraisal. Equalization of values be performed prior to a congressional passage of this bill and not after. Do you see that as a public interest requirement or a requirement in the appraisal process as you see it? The appraisal process be done prior to rather than after the passage of the bill.
Is that question to me, Mr.
Yes.
Grijalva? The public interest determination that is usually done when a land exchange is considered is actually pre-NEPA. It actually looks at the qualities of the non-federal parcels, the issues of the federal parcels. It's not predicated on a appraisal of the lands, a complete appraisal of the lands. An estimate of values is done to determine a public interest.
And that's for both witnesses. Throughout his administration, President Obama has been committed to enhancing the partnership with Native nations and the federal government. Very vocal about his support for a real consultation process and a government-to-government relationship that has formality and process. If this bill were to becomes law, will the federal government be able to meet its commitment under whether it's a memorandum of understanding your agency might have or the initiative of the president? Would you be able to meet that commitment to a meaningful consultation with Native nations affected by this legislation?
The Department of Agriculture doesn't believe that meaningful consultation can occur without the NEPA process preceding the land exchange decision.
I was going, this bill, I think, plainly waives NEPA with regard to the land exchange. The decision to trade federal land, forest land, particularly land that was set aside during the Eisenhower administration and withdrawn from mining to a mining company, a foreign-owned mining company, is likely to impact the human environment. NEPA would be required prior to exchange, prior to the exchange, if this bill did not specifically waive that application, right or wrong.
That's correct.
And I think for the record, because we were talking about 1/10 of 1%, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to announce that the federal judge in Arizona threw out the case on the withdrawal of the 1 million acres around the Grand Canyon, and we can rest assured for a little while that that beautiful icon will continue to be a beautiful icon. Yield back. Chairman Rambler, and thank you very much for being here as well. Oak Flats, significance. You know, you hear that we're going to leave the surface alone, so what's the problem? The proponents of the legislation say, we're going to leave the surface alone, so what's the problem? And would you please tell them what the problem with that is going to be down the road, not only in terms of a sacred site, but in terms of the excavation that could potentially occur underneath?
Yes, thank you. I know in reading some parts of the bill itself, the proposed bill, it talks about surface, but it doesn't talk about subsurface. So on the surface, for example, Oak Flat and Apache Leap itself, even though in this particular case the bill itself may say Apache Leap will not be disturbed and a fence may be put around it to not disturb it further, but there's nothing there that prevents it from being disturbed underneath. So when we look at it in total, the sacredness of the whole area in total. And so when underground it's going to be disturbed, when there's going to be a big hole left under there, and we don't know what the potential impact is to the water resources, but we know from history that when there's a big hole and it rains and it snows and water comes running down, where's that water going to go? It's going to go to that big hole. And so we don't know what's the impacts are, and that's how we believe that what's going to happen underground is going to affect whatever is going to be on the surface.
Thank you. You know, there's been discussion saying that, this bill does not weaken the NEPA process, and that there's some people are convinced that the state of Arizona permitting process for mines on private lands is the same as NEPA, even if we sidestep NEPA in this one. It's absolutely not true. The state's far weaker. The public comment period is short. Before submit, there is no quick turnaround in the submission of critical document. There is no pre-scoping, and the process does not require bonding to guarantee a cleanup and reclamation after the fact. And that's just the environmental side of it. On the consultation, that's a whole other story that doesn't exist. And so there is no substitute for, one, skipping over NEPA and doing it after the fact where there's no enforceability, and saying, well, the state can take care of it. The state can't take care of it. The state won't take care of it. This NEPA process guarantees not only the people of Superior and the surrounding community that the viability and the intended or unintended consequences of this mine, everybody's going to know up front. And for the life of me, many of the critics of this process would have been shut up a long time ago, 5 years ago. But for some reason, there is a drive to get it done without NEPA, do it after the fact. If there would have been agreement, let's do NEPA now, we'd be waiting and resolving and debating what the remediation would have had to be. The consultation government to government, we would have dealt with those consequences. And maybe they wouldn't have been good consequences. One suspects, and it's only a suspicion, that a full-blown NEPA process with public comment is going to disclose and make transparent some consequences that not only the tribes and the council lady from Superior are going to be opposed to. They're going to have some consequences that the whole region will be very, very concerned, particularly around water and sacred sites. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.